They're still coming up with the music, and I think they're idiots to break up. There's any reason to break up, you know.
The pen hovered over the contract like a loaded weapon. It was 1984 in a quiet boardroom somewhere in London. Freddie Mercury sat alone across from CBS Records executives. A $4 million solo deal laid out in front of him. One of the biggest offers ever made to a rock vocalist. But there was one problem. No one from Queen knew he was there. Brian May didn't know. Roger Taylor didn't know. John Deacon didn't know. And as Freddie lowered his pen to sign, he crossed a line that would trigger one of the most turbulent chapters in the band's history. Most people only know the Hollywood version, the dramatic meltdown shown in Bohemian Rhapsody. Freddie storms out, betrays the band, gets lost in excess, then returns at the 11th hour for Live Aid. Great cinema, almost entirely fictional. Because the real story, the true secret that nearly broke Queen in half, wasn't just about money or fame or ego. It was about exhaustion, miscommunication, creative frustration, and four men trying to hold together something the world believed was unbreakable. This is the truth Brian May finally revealed. The truth behind the deal Freddie signed in secret, the fears it created, and how it pushed Queen closer to collapse than anyone ever realized. But before we get to the moment that almost tore them apart, we need to understand what Queen had become by 1983. A band standing at the edge of burnout, running out of patience, and dangerously close to losing the chemistry that made them legends. Because what happened next was far more explosive than anything shown in theaters, and far more human than the world ever knew. By the time 1983 arrived, Queen was running on fumes. They had spent more than a decade recording, touring, promoting, and performing at a pace that would have crushed most bands within a few years. The world saw glamour, the packed stadiums, the explosive anthems, the unforgettable theatrics. But behind the curtain, cracks were beginning to widen. Hot Space was the breaking point. Released in 1982, the album was Freddie's boldest artistic experiment yet. Disco, funk, dance, rhythms that were light years away from the classic Queen sound. Freddie loved it. Critics hated it. Fans were confused. The backlash hit harder than expected. Shows sold out, yes, but something had changed. For the first time, Queen felt uncertain, and the tension between Freddie and Brian May was reaching a boiling point. Brian later admitted they could barely stay in the same room together without an argument erupting. Freddie wanted to push Queen into the future. Synthesizers, dance beats, bold risks. Brian wanted to protect the rock roots that had made them global giants. Both were right. Both were stubborn. The band wasn't breaking up. But they needed space. Real space. So Queen agreed on something they'd never done before. A break. No tours, no pressure, no studio deadlines. Just time apart to breathe. And maybe rediscover the spark they had lost. But breaks have consequences. Distance changes people. And while the band tried to recover, Freddie Mercury began drifting in a direction none of them expected. Because while Queen rested, Freddie made a decision that would change everything. While Queen quietly stepped into their first real break in years, Freddie Mercury stepped into something very different. A private meeting scheduled behind closed doors with no agenda shared, no band member informed, and no hint of what he was preparing to do. He arrived at the CBS Records office dressed immaculately as always, but unusually tense. Freddie wasn't the flamboyant frontman in this room. He wasn't the center of a roaring stadium. He was a man confronting a choice he had postponed for years. The desire to explore his own musical identity without the gravitational pull of Queen's expectations. The offer laid out before him was staggering, $4 million for a solo album. At the time, most bands wouldn't see that kind of money in their entire careers. Freddie didn't need to be told what this meant. It was validation, permission, freedom. But it came with a cost. Freddie signed the deal quietly. No celebrations, no phone calls, no mention to Brian, Roger, or John. It wasn't out of malice. It wasn't betrayal. It was fear. Fear that they wouldn't understand. Fear that they would hold him back. Fear that he needed to prove something. To them, to himself, and to the world. Yet, that secrecy was exactly what made the moment explosive. Because while Freddie walked out of the building with a life-changing contract, Queen still thought they were on a mutual break. They had no idea their frontman had just taken the biggest step of his career, alone. And when the truth surfaced weeks later, it didn't feel like a creative experiment. It felt like Freddie was already halfway out the door. But the bigger question was still coming. Was Freddie truly planning to leave Queen? Or was he running from something else entirely? When Freddie Mercury moved to Munich in the early 1980s, it didn't look suspicious at first. Munich had studios, nightlife, freedom, a creative playground. But to Brian, Roger, and John, something felt different this time. Freddie wasn't just traveling, he was escaping. Munich gave him something London couldn't: anonymity. In its neon-lit clubs and smoky bars, Freddie wasn't Freddie Mercury, rock legend, global icon, leader of Queen. He was simply Fred, a man who wanted to dance, laugh, experiment, and forget the pressure of being the voice behind a billion-dollar empire. The nightlife embraced him instantly. The city's underground scene became his second home. He stayed out late, surrounded himself with new faces, new lovers, new friends, people who didn't ask him about guitar riffs, album sales, or the future of Queen. People who celebrated him for his energy, not his obligations. But distance can be a dangerous thing. Brian May later admitted he felt shut out, confused, hurt, blindsided. Queen had always been a family. Suddenly it felt like Freddie had found a new one, and they weren't invited. When whispers about the secret CBS contract reached the band, everything clicked into place. Munich wasn't just a getaway, it looked like a launching pad. Was Freddie setting up a life without Queen? Had the nightlife, the new freedom, the $4 million deal convinced him to start over? Was the break they agreed to really a break, or the beginning of the end? For the first time since forming the band, Queen felt something unfamiliar: fear. Fear that Freddie Mercury, the irreplaceable heart of Queen, was slipping away one Munich night at a time. But the truth was far more complicated and far more emotional. From the outside, it looked like Freddie Mercury wanted to abandon Queen. But inside, something entirely different was happening. Something raw, artistic, and deeply personal. Freddie wasn't trying to run away from the band. He was trying to run towards something he'd felt for years: pure, unfiltered creative freedom. Queen, for all their brilliance, had become a battlefield of ideas. Brian wanted thunderous rock guitars. Roger wanted sharp, fast, powerful anthems. John preferred groove-driven elegance. And Freddie? Freddie wanted everything: disco, opera, funk, dance, pop theater, massive choruses, impossible harmonies, and sonic experiments no one else in rock dared to attempt. He once said, "I like to do everything. I get bored of just one thing." Hot Space, his boldest experiment, was rejected brutally. Critics mocked it. Fans were divided. The band itself resisted many of his ideas. And behind every studio argument, Freddie felt one thing: he was being pushed back into the box he'd spent his life breaking out of. Munich gave him the opposite: no rules, no expectations, no Queen identity to protect, just creativity. The CBS deal wasn't a betrayal, it was a lifeline. Mr. Bad Guy, the album that would emerge from this freedom, was Freddie's chance to prove he wasn't just a rock singer, he was a world builder, a voice that could bend genres, not be confined by them. Producer Reinhold Mack later said, Freddie resisted anything that sounded too rock because it reminded him of the creative tug-of-war inside Queen. Freddie wasn't leaving the band, he was trying to breathe. But the irony was brutal. The very freedom he craved would soon reveal something he never expected. Because working alone felt liberating, until the loneliness hit. Munich had promised freedom, but the studio walls told a different story. When Freddie Mercury walked into Musicland Studios to record Mr. Bad Guy, he imagined a new era, one where he could finally unleash every idea he'd ever held back. No arguments, no compromises, no Brian reminding him it needed more guitar. No pressure from the Queen machine, just Freddie and his imagination. But imagination can be a cruel companion when you're used to creating magic with three other minds. Freddie expected the sessions to feel exhilarating. Instead, they often felt empty. The studio was silent between takes. There were no sarcastic jokes from Roger, no quiet bass ideas from John, no guitar wizardry from Brian to elevate a melody into something transcendent. It was just him. That's when the calls began. Late at night. Always from Munich. Always from Freddie. He called Roger first. "Rog, darling, can you fly here? I need your voice on these harmonies." Roger agreed, not out of obligation, but because he could hear something in Freddie's voice. Loneliness disguised as creative excitement. Then came the calls to others. Friends, musicians, familiar faces. Freddie was trying to fill a void that success couldn't fix. And in that empty studio, he learned something painful. Queen wasn't just a band. It was the engine that transformed his ideas into masterpieces. He could sing alone. He could write alone. He could even create alone. But he couldn't become Freddie Mercury alone. Even the album he was pouring his soul into felt like a reflection of that truth. Brilliant in places, but missing the spark that only Queen could ignite. Yet Freddie wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. Because the consequences of his silence were about to catch up with him. The truth always finds a way out. And in 1984, it didn't just slip into Queen's world, it detonated inside it. Brian May was the first to hear the rumor. A friend in the industry mentioned almost casually that Freddie had signed a massive solo deal. At first, Brian laughed it off. Freddie was impulsive, dramatic, secretive, but not reckless enough to hide something that major. But then the numbers came. $4 million. More money than any of them had ever seen for a single project. More than Roger had been offered. More than Brian had earned for his collaborations. More than Queen itself had ever been paid for one album. Suddenly, the room went silent. Roger reacted with disbelief. John said nothing, but the look on his face said enough. Brian felt something deeper. Not anger, not jealousy, but heartbreak. They weren't upset that Freddie went solo. Roger had done it. Brian had done it. They all believed in exploring individual creativity. What hurt, what truly hurt, was that he did it alone, in secret, behind their backs. For the first time since they formed Queen, Freddie Mercury felt separate, and the band felt replaced. When Freddie walked into the next meeting, he felt the air change instantly. Nobody yelled, nobody accused, but the silence was louder than any argument they'd ever had. Freddie tried to explain, but the truth stuck in his throat. He didn't want them to think they weren't enough. He didn't want them to believe he was planning an exit. He wasn't abandoning Queen. He was trying to rediscover himself. But the damage was already done. For the first time in their legendary career, Queen looked fragile. Like a single wrong word could shatter everything they had built. And that word was coming. When the confrontation finally happened, Queen wasn't in a rehearsal room or a studio. They were backstage at a promotional event. A place where they were supposed to smile for cameras and pretend everything was perfect. But nothing felt perfect. Freddie walked in wearing one of his tailored jackets, sunglasses hiding the exhaustion in his eyes. Brian, Roger, and John were already waiting. Nobody said a word. For a moment, it looked like four strangers, not four men who had changed rock history together. Brian broke the silence. "Freddie, why didn't you tell us?" Freddie opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The performer who could command 100,000 people suddenly looked small, almost fragile. "I didn't want to be stopped," he finally said. The words hit the room like a punch. Freddie continued, voice trembling just enough for them to hear the truth in it. "I needed space to do what I wanted. I needed to see who I was without Queen. Just once." He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't cruel. He was lost. The battles over hot space had shaken him more than he ever admitted. Every criticism, every argument, every creative clash had carved deeper insecurities into him. Freddie wanted to prove, to himself, that he could still stand on his own. But Brian's response was devastating in its honesty. "You didn't need to prove anything to us. We only needed you to trust us." For the first time in years, Freddie looked like his own success had betrayed him. The contract didn't break Queen. Secrecy did. And the distrust it created wouldn't fade overnight. Still, something unexpected was about to happen. Something no one in that room could see coming. Because even as Queen fractured, the world was preparing to witness the moment that would save them. When Queen reunited for rehearsals in the summer of 1985, the atmosphere was cautious. They weren't the tightly bonded brothers they once were. They were four men walking on cracked ground, careful not to trigger another collapse. Live Aid was just weeks away. A global audience of nearly 2 billion people was expected. It wasn't just another show, it was the show. But Freddie arrived different. He wasn't the explosive, unstoppable presence they remembered. His voice was still golden, but there was a quietness in him, like a man carrying invisible weight. The first rehearsal was awkward. Freddie avoided Brian's eyes. Roger tapped nervously at his drumsticks. John kept a poker face, hiding the tension behind calm silence. Then something happened. They started playing Bohemian Rhapsody. Just a warm-up, nothing serious. But the moment Freddie sang the first line, something electric shot through the room. Brian later said, "It was like the universe snapped back into place." The music didn't feel forced anymore. Freddie wasn't performing at them. He was performing with them. For the first time in years, Queen felt aligned. The chemistry that had built stadiums, broken records, and shaped rock history came roaring back to life. Still, this was only rehearsal. The real test would come on July 13, 1985. When they walked onto the Wembley stage, 72,000 people screamed at once. The world froze. Cameras rolled. Every band hoped to deliver a memorable performance. But what Queen did was something else entirely. In just 20 minutes, they created the greatest live moment in rock history. A performance so powerful that even now, decades later, experts study it as the blueprint for a perfect show. And in those 20 minutes, something inside Freddie finally healed. When Queen walked off the Live Aid stage, something was different, and everyone felt it instantly. The crowd was still roaring, the cameras were still rolling, but Freddie wasn't thinking about the lights, the applause, or the headlines that would come the next morning. He was thinking about his band. For the first time in years, Freddie Mercury had felt the full force of what Queen truly was. Not four men fighting over creative control, but four souls locked in perfect synchrony, elevating each other in ways none of them could achieve alone. Backstage, instead of the usual post-show chaos, there was a strange quiet between them. Roger looked at Freddie with something like disbelief. Brian kept shaking his head, smiling in a way Freddie hadn't seen in years. John, the calmest of them all, simply said, "That felt right." Freddie didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over his face. He had spent years searching for freedom, thinking it existed outside of Queen. Munich couldn't give it to him. Solo deals couldn't give it to him. Producers, lovers, money, fame. None of it could replace the spark he had just felt on that stage. The realization hit him with overwhelming clarity. He needed them. Not because they completed his music, but because they completed him. That night, Freddie made a silent promise. One he'd never say out loud, but one that shaped every decision he made afterward. Queen comes first. The scars between them didn't disappear. The wounds weren't magically healed. But Live Aid had forced their hearts back into alignment. Yet, the most emotional moment of Freddie's journey, the one that would bind him to Queen forever, was still ahead. After Live Aid, Queen didn't just come back together, they became something deeper, something unbreakable. The arguments faded, the ego softened, and for the first time in a very long time, Freddie no longer felt the need to run. He walked into the studio differently. No walls, no defensiveness, no secrecy. Brian would bring a riff, and Freddie actually listened. Roger would pitch an idea, and Freddie didn't push back. John, quiet as always, became the rhythmic glue that held them steady. It was as if Live Aid had reset the universe, and Freddie knew it. Because in the years that followed, as his health quietly began to fade, Freddie made a choice most people never knew about. He worked harder after his diagnosis than at any other point in his life. Not for money, not for fame, not for a solo legacy, but for Queen. He refused pity. He refused slowing down. He refused to let the illness take the one thing he loved most, creating music with the only three people who truly understood him. Brian would later reveal moments in the studio where Freddie could barely stand, yet insisted on recording just one more take. Roger described times when Freddie would joke about his pain, anything to keep the mood light. John said Freddie carried an invisible weight but never let it dim the room. Freddie wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for them, for the band that had shaped his life more than any spotlight ever could. And that's the emotional truth people rarely hear. Freddie Mercury didn't leave Queen. He held them together until he couldn't hold himself anymore. If you felt the weight of the story, if Freddie's journey means something to you, then take a moment right now. Tell us in the comments which era of Queen defined your life. Like the video if you felt something real today, and subscribe, because we're keeping Freddie's legacy alive with every story we tell. The man who once feared losing himself found his true identity in Queen, and he left this world with the one promise he never broke: the music must go on.